And I want to thank everybody for being with us today. We are excited to talk to you about our new call for proposals, really focused on the area of youth. My name is Lorez Meinhold. I'm the Executive Director of Caring for Denver, and Jennifer is joining us today. Jennifer, can you introduce yourself?
Yep, I'm Jennifer Tippett. I'm a program advisor for Caring for Denver Foundation and also a licensed clinical forensic psychologist.
Again, thank you all for joining us. We're going to walk through the call for proposal. It can be found on our resource page, and then we're going to open it up to you all for questions. So really excited about this new opportunity. For those of you that don't know about Caring for Denver Foundation, Caring for Denver was founded and funded with voter support in November of 2018 to address mental health and substance misuse challenges facing the residents of Denver. We are really doing this by lifting up community-informed solutions, dismantling stigma, and turning the community's desire to help into action. So we're, again, excited about this youth area of proposal. Jennifer's going to walk through it a little bit more, but it's really focused at innovative mental health, trauma, and substance misuse supports, which increase youth's resilience to life stresses and pressures, address mental health and substance misuse early, and provide support for families and allies of youth to better support youth in their healing. Caring for Denver really considers anybody between the ages of 0 to 26 as youth. That's what we heard from community. But we recognize not all proposals need to address that entire age range, but this is meant to serve that entire range of population. As we go through this, you're going to hear a lot of words and thoughts. Where we got these were both through our community engagement, where we did that in October and December of 2018. And we talked to 1,600 people to say what was important, and youth was lifted up in that. In addition to that, we talked to almost 100 people to really say what was important. And those 100 people were providers, they were parents, and they were youth themselves. Over 50 youth informed the document that you are looking at. So we're really excited about this opportunity. Again, I will have Jennifer now walk through the funding overview itself, and then I'll talk about impact and timelines. And then again, we're going to turn it over to you to ask us questions. And you're going to do that in the chat function, and we will do our best to answer all the questions. Jennifer, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks. So yeah, this funding area is really exciting. We're looking at wanting to uplift and amplify programs that are innovative in delivering mental health, trauma, and substance misuse supports to our youth in Denver. And within that kind of broad bucket, we identified some real priority areas. The first of which is resilience to life stressors and pressures. So looking at maybe peer and mentoring activities that are supported, expanded, and promoted to address mental health, trauma, and substance misuse. So that kind of peer role of someone with lived experience that they're encouraging, they've made it, they're kind of real, they meet youth where they're at. Programs that are doing a lot of that we're interested in. And then mental health, substance misuse, and trauma-informed supports that are increased for youth impacted by loss, violence, and school disruption. These supports should really focus on increasing a sense of belonging and purpose and adding to that resilience piece for our youth. Also looking at education, resources, and supports that occur in spaces in which youth trust and feel safe and are empowering for youth to heal. As we know, it can be a barrier to walk into a mental health office or clinic. So those programs that are going into the spaces where youth already are and offering those services so that youth can build that bond and that sort of relationship naturally. And then also mental health and substance misuse messages that are developed and spread by youth in their own voice. So really amplifying youth voice and what they are saying that they need and talking to each other directly to each other rather than through what adults think youth might need or need to say. The second priority area within this bucket addresses mental health and substance misuse early. So we know from research, from literature, that early intervention is always our best bet to head off things that come down the road. So this might look like art and activities offered to address mental health, trauma, and substance misuse that encourage self-expression without shame and envision a healthy future. So providing that space for youth to really express who they are and what lives and paths they've lived without needing to feel shame or embarrassment, and really kind of grow through artistic interventions and factors. Maybe risk factors and trauma are addressed early on. So those early intervention programs looking at healthy development, coping strategies. We know that emotional regulation and some of those pieces that don't always get endowed early. If we can get in there and provide some of that, that's really helpful. This could also look like supports addressing mental health and substance misuse as early as possible, and including pregnancy. That's always a favorite area of mine to address, that perinatal period, looking at those really early interventions from in utero on, possibly resources and supports provided that remove cultural barriers, not possibly, absolutely, remove cultural barriers, address stigma, and increase positive perspectives about seeking care for youth and families. So any programs that are looking to really enhance and uplift marginalized communities and their access to services and programs, and kind of dismantle the stigma that prevents many communities from seeking help. And then thirdly, in our priorities, supports for families, caregivers, and allies of youth. So those programs that are not just focusing on youth, but are also providing that wraparound services for families, caregivers, anyone who is within a youth system, and able to support. So recognizing symptoms and have resources to address early signs of need. Often we hear from caregivers and supports, I just didn't see it, or I just didn't know what to look for. So programs who are building that up. And then trusted connections and supports for families to increase their ability to support youth in the healing. So often we know that mental health sometimes impacts the entire family system. So programs that are looking at providing support are also something that we are interested in.
Thank you, Jennifer. And so the impact we want to have with this, the things that we will ask how your programs work towards achieving this desired impact would be, we want to see reduced harm to self or others by addressing trauma, mental health, and substance misuse in your program or projects. We want to see increased ability to demonstrate healthy resilience for coping with challenges and stresses in life. Increased awareness and involvement by families and or allies in ways that help youth address trauma, mental health, and substance misuse, and overall improve mental health and or reduce substance misuse by youth. You do not have to, your project program doesn't have to address all of those impacts. It can address one, it can address two, it can address all, but we'll just ask you to ask us which area are we going to try to measure impact of your project or program. The award considerations are also really important. That comes a little bit later, and so I want to make sure you all don't miss that. We heard over and over again from youth and parents, but especially youth, how do we make sure these projects, programs are youth-informed, youth-led, and engage young people as partners in the work? And it might be allies or parents in that work, depending on your project or program. Really important to focus on innovative approaches. How do we think about this and do these maybe a little differently? It doesn't mean if you have a program and it's working that we wouldn't look at that as well, but it's also recognizing we have opportunity to try things a little differently. How do we make sure this, whatever you are proposing, is meaningful to youth, where they are, and informs that work for them? How do we make sure we reach youth have been impacted by trauma and inequitable access to resources and supports? How do we make sure we focus on the strengths of youth? And we value culture and healing and identity. So I wanted to make sure we hit those because our grant cycles have been pretty competitive. In our last one, we received over 96 proposals for $28 million, and we only had about $6 million to give. This grant cycle will be, it'll be closer to 10 million that we will be giving away to address some of those youth needs. What I'll ask as you think about your budget, is that while its funding is up to 10 million, you really should consider the total amount available to everybody, to all organizations and agencies. And we will look at budgets and evaluate them on their reasonableness. So I just want to make sure that, we do have more resources to give, but the requests have exceeded even the resources we've had in every area. The applications are due on December 17th. And then the deadline, if you have not already applied for a grant, or if you've not already registered in our Flux system, you just need to do so by December 7th. If you've already applied for a grant, if you've received funding, you are already registered in Flux and do not need to do that again. So now we are really, Jennifer, unless you think I left something out, we're going to start addressing the questions.
Yep.
All right. So do we need to specify how we will measure the impact in the priority areas? You don't have to specify right now. If you have a sense of something that you're collecting, or data or information that you're collecting that you think will help us figure that out, great. But we will, if awarded a grant, we'll work with you to actually say, like, what's important to you to measure. So as a foundation, we're not going to say you have to measure A, B, C, D. We're going to work with you to say, what does success look like? How would you measure if you're making impact in improving mental health? And then work with you on that measure. So it's not something you have to have for the application, but if you're already doing it and you feel like you have a good measure, you can go ahead and share that. Will we need to select a priority area? No, you might say we're going to work with youth. You might say that we're going to work with parents. Again, we're just saying those are the 3 areas that we're most focused on that we want to see proposals address, but you might work across that. We are not doing general support grants, general operating grants. So it needs to be a project or a program that's addressing those needs. But again, we recognize they're not 3 independent buckets and that there's a lot of overlap between them.
We want the overlap.
Yep. And what if a program spans multiple or all areas? Perfect. That's great. Again, there's not a requirement that you need to, but if you do, that's great. We recognize the continuum and the continuity. And so sometimes, you're starting early, but you also need to address trauma and other things. And by doing that, you need to work with parents. So again, we recognize that it might, but it's not a requirement. Will programs in schools be considered? Yes, in Denver public schools or schools in Denver. So just as a reminder, we are a sales tax in the city and county of Denver. So we can only fund people, residents of Denver and or Denver public schools or schools in Denver. Let me say it that way. What is the average grant amount? I was wondering when that question would come. So I will just say we've only done 2 grant cycles. So let me just say for our last one that I just referenced, community centered, we had grants that spanned 1, 2, or 3 years. We will do multi-year grants. Up to 3 years is the most. We just awarded 27 grants for a total of $5.8 million. So the average grant size for this last time was about $215,000. So that was even if it was just average across all of that. I didn't divide that up or change that depending on the multi-year. The cycle before, it was slightly larger in alternatives to jail, but we were building whole systems of care. So I would imagine that 215 to 250 is generally the average size to date. So again, we're still learning and figuring this out. Have all decisions on last cycle been made? We just had our board meeting on Monday and just reviewed the community centered. So if you haven't been notified yet of award or declination, you will be ideally this week. But if somebody in particular has a question, you can reach out to me directly and happy to talk to you more about that. So again, if you've been awarded or haven't been awarded, you can still apply in the youth if you are serving youth. But I will say, if you have had an award, we will take that into consideration. Again, just given the need that's in community and the amount of requests we're getting, we're really trying to have as much depth and spread as we possibly can. What is the funding period for this grant? It's the funding period that you tell me it is. So what I'll tell you is we anticipate, receiving the applications by December 17th. We hope to make awards by March. On average, we have been doing about 4 months from receipt to award. This one might be slightly longer because we have a few holidays mixed in there. But then it would start, we try to get you that grant contract in that March, April timeframe. And so it would really be starting in that, probably, I would say, plan on that April timeline. And again, you can ask for 1, 2, or 3 years of funding. If an organization receives funding for another priority area, can we apply again for this priority area? Yes is the answer. But again, if you receive funding, we'll be taking that into consideration as we look at other proposals that come in. So again, we're trying to have as much spread and reach as possible. And again, it depends if you came in on community-centered or alternatives to jail. We also know some organizations receive some COVID funding. I would say that won't factor in. The COVID grants that we had made were smaller grants. That won't factor as much into that consideration. But if you received a grant or a large grant in alternatives to jail or community-centered, we will take that into consideration as we're looking at some of the other proposals. Would it be possible to fund additional counselor to support mental health needs within students and families? Generally, yes, would be the answer. I mean, we're really looking, so while we talk about youth, it really is about mental health and substance misuse. So when we talk about counselors or peer navigators, again, youth told us over and over again how important peers were in their healing and recovery and coping. So, and again, I think as you're looking to add positions, really being able to articulate that you worked on whatever you're doing with parents and students and others, that this is really a reflection of what you heard they need. What I'll tell you is that we did, again, schools are going to be one of the places students receive care, but it's not going to be the only. Some students trust schools as a place to get care. Some don't. And students and youth need to really feel safe in what they're sharing and telling. That's what we heard over and over again, is that where am I going to feel safe? Recognizing that duty to report. And so schools might not always be that place. So just making sure as you're designing or building programs, you've really articulated how in that particular instance, students and families talk to you about that is the need they had, or however you're designing this, they had a say into that. Jennifer, would you add anything? Your daughter, Kaylin, helped us really reach out to other youth and talk about this. And she is at East herself. And I don't know if there's anything you heard from her related to that would be important.
Yeah, I mean, I think you captured the piece about the peers being really important. And, school is sometimes where you can insert some of these services. And then sometimes it's really fraught with a lot of other context for youth. So outside of that, and then also the thing that my daughter talked about in reaching out and helping out with this piece was, diversity and equity and being reflective of the community that's being served, or at least being thoughtful and knowledgeable. Sometimes is hit or miss. So it's something that they really highlighted was important.
What does the selection process look like? Now, that's a pretty broad, big question, but what I'll say is, we'll look at all the proposals we receive once we get to December 17th. So again, we're also happy to work with you. If you have questions on the application, you'll be able to reach out to Leah on that. If you have questions about your proposal, I can talk to you about that. But since this is an open call for proposals, I can't tell you yes or no, but I'm happy to raise questions or have you think about things. But So once December 17th passes, we can look at the proposals. We'll review those and we'll really look at see how well did they address the call for proposal, the additional criteria. Did they meet the criteria of serving city and county of Denver? Are they addressing mental health and are they addressing youth? We also leverage community reviewers, look at our proposals, and they let us know what do they think some of the strengths are, the challenges are, and what insight should we have. Part of our community review process this time will likely include youth as well. We want to get a sense of, is this something they would participate in? Does this feel comfortable? Does this sound like something that would be helpful to me? After we do that community review and sort of have a sense of strengths, challenges, and things that some questions we need to ask in the due diligence process, then we'll engage in a due diligence process. And the due diligence looks like a lot of things. Sometimes that includes a site visit. Sometimes we'll look at website, other information, any information, additional information you shared. We might ask you all for additional information beyond this initial application. And then we run it sort of, we have a process where we identify impact, organization, all those components and pieces, almost a matrix to then be able to lift up and really talk through what are the recommendations to bring to the board. So that's generally what the selection process looks like. And again, it's not necessarily, each application is individual and different, and so it's not always going to be the same process, even if you've been funded before. So again, we got another question about, we applied, we just had our board meeting on Monday to review the community centered. Again, we're doing our best to open and close proposals as quickly as possible so that we can get money into the community as quickly as possible. So if you have not been notified yet, you will likely receive notification this week by Friday. But again, feel free to reach out to me if you haven't received notification yet. What is the average length of projects? Is there a preference for project length? There is no average length of projects. I will say on average, both cycles, we've had about a third funded for a year, a third funded for 2 years, and a third funded for 3 years. There isn't a preference for project length. Just again, what we have to do. So again, for the last cycle, we received 96 proposals for $28 million, knowing that we only had 5 to 6. Even if you asked for 2 or 3 years, we started from the starting place. Okay, if we were to fund everybody at 1 year, what does that look like? And evaluate it that way. And then looking at sort of, sometimes if it's new programs, only having a year of funding doesn't make sense. You're not sure you can continue. You don't want to offer that to community knowing you might have to pull it away. We might look at then sort of what kind of program, is it new, is it expansion? What are the other proposals we're looking at? So there isn't really a preference. Ask us for what you need, both in terms of budget and project length. We're going to look at it and try to judge, does it seem appropriate? Does it feel right? And what I'll tell you is first we look for that fit. How well do you align and match for the call for proposals? And then if there's any change in the length or the budget amount, we're going to work with you on that and have those conversations. So we won't bring anything to the board that won't really work for you. Again, we do our best. As you know, during this time of COVID and even prior to COVID, we have such need within our community. Unfortunately, we can't fund everything, and we can't always fund everything to what you ask. So really what I'd ask is make sure the budgets are reasonable. Ask us for what you need, and we'll continue to work with you sort of both on that time length and amount to figure out what's right.
Not to interrupt, Flores, but
no.
I was thinking the other thing that we often ask about, especially during the due diligence process with relation to project length, is sustainability. We really do want to create and uphold projects that we're going to keep going and be able to exist beyond us. So.
Thank you. So one of the questions is, so how much have we dispersed so far? And so to date, we have, so again, a reminder, we receive monthly payments from the city, but that's not reconciled until the following year. So even though we've been receiving payments for 2020, that doesn't get reconciled until March of 2021. So we're always giving the last year's funding away. So of the 36 million we had to give away from 2019, we've given away, with our awards for the board on Monday, we've given away over 22 million. We are, again, looking to do up to 10 million in this funding area. And then the final funding area care provision will happen in early 2021. And so the reason that this area is slightly bigger too is we're anticipating getting the reconciled amount for 2021 at the same time. So we're giving away both the 2019 and 2020 funds for youth, and we'll do the same for care provision. And then we'll be on that cycle of giving away the year's funds. So again, we've given away, and just a reminder, we got the city contract in September of 2019, even though we were approved on the ballot in 2018. So, and the first thing that we were required to do in the ordinance was to engage community about how these funds should be spent. And so that's where our funding document came from. And then we got our funding out as quickly as possible with our first funding area and alternatives to jail in April. And then we did our second area, community centered. Our board approved those awards. We've done some innovative and responsive funding, and the city withholds some of those funds. Again, we got the question of, will previously funded agencies be considered? Again, we are gonna give preference to organizations, or what I will say is we will take that into consideration. If you received a grant in alternatives to jail or in the community centered area, we're gonna look at that, and that will be part of our consideration as we look at the other requests that we receive. Again, we're trying to have as much breadth and depth in our awards as possible. You stated this can't be used for organizational support. Does this include salaries for staff? So what I said is we won't be funding general operating grants. So if there are staff that are supporting your projects or programs, or you're looking to hire staff to be a peer navigator or do that, we can cover that. But we won't be just generally funding your operations. So the difference would be if you are running a program and it will require some oversight of a program manager to help with that peer navigator, then we would fund the appropriate amount of that time to oversee that new position or program. This seems to be focused on teens and young adults. Would kids 0 to 10 be eligible? Yes, so as stated early on, youth, for this funding area, while we say youth, it is 0 to 26. And that's because when we talk to community, whether their child was 5 or 25, they all said they're my child, they're my youth. And so we're using the term that's most appropriate for community. But if you look at that middle area that Jennifer reviewed before, it was really talking about identifying risk factors early. So it's talking about pregnancy. So again, we are looking at frames from 0 to 26 when we are talking to this area. So early intervention.
Love early intervention.
Love early intervention, love and we love support for our teens and our older youth as well. So again, it's a continuum of care and a continuum of supports.
Yep.
Was less money collected on first year of grant making slower? I'm not sure I quite understand that, but 2019 we collected 36 million. Because of COVID, the 2020, initially the 2020 numbers were much higher, but because of COVID and the situation, because we're again dependent on sales tax revenue and we're not done yet with 2020, it will be less than initially anticipated. So it's estimated right now, the city thinks we'll get somewhere between 32 and 34 million in 2020. But again, we won't know what our 2020 revenues are until March of 21. Once we know that, we'll then be making all those allocations. Because again, as you all know, we don't have an endowment or a corpus like another foundation. We can only give away what we have. And if we give you money, we can't take it back. And we don't want to take it back. So that's why we need to be sure of what we have before we give it away, to give you the assurity that you can run your programs in the way we said we would be able to help you. Will a recording of this live event be available after the session? Yes. It'll be posted on the website, on our website. So you will be able, because we know that Facebook Live works for folks that have Facebook and not everybody does. So we want to make sure this recording is accessible for everyone. On our resource page, there's also some frequently asked questions. And again, we're here to help. We can't necessarily direct you in your proposal, but we can answer some general questions if something didn't make sense. Is an organization not based in Denver but serve youth in Denver, are they eligible to apply? Yes. So if you are an organization that's in Aurora or in another part of the Denver metro area, you can apply for funds, but you can only use our funds to serve Denver youth. And so what we will likely do, or you'll have to think about, is how will you be able to track the Denver youth you're serving? And then that is what we can fund. Again, we don't have flexibility in that, and we don't have flexibility in that we're addressing mental health and substance misuse. But we recognize that geography are lines, and this is also about where youth are and where they feel most comfortable. And so if that is the place you are in, then we can consider your funding, and it's just you will need to be able to demonstrate that those dollars serve Denver youth. Yeah. Interventions that address the systems themselves are helpful. Can I include that in the proposal? Yes. Systems is part of the solution, but what I'll say is those systems need to be trusted. So as many of you know, mental health and substance misuse, it's challenging. There are cultural barriers, there are economic barriers, there are lots of barriers. There's even systemic barriers. And so recognizing, in order to bring youth into this, and again, or pregnant women, doing early childhood, it has to be a place of trust. And so again, I think if you're working on a systemic change, or you're working with a system that might not have the trust, talk to us just how you're going to address that. Jennifer, would you add anything to that?
I think I think it's a really good point. And if it's going to address the systems, we'll probably want to see how it is going to directly impact or change the care or the services provided to the youth. Well, when I know what the direct impact is going to be, that's just thinking, putting my program officer hat on, that's probably something that I would ask in a site visit.
If collaboration involves an organization that has been funded in another cycle, is that a good or bad thing? It's neither a good or bad thing. Well, what I'll say is we love collaboration. Collaboration is great because it means you can have broader reach, but collaboration is not required. If you're partnering with an organization that we funded, that means we know them, we know they have trust in community. But again, this is about but that doesn't, if you're not partnering with an organization that's been funded, that doesn't again mean that's not good or bad. What I'll say is collaboration is good, but not required. And it really isn't, it doesn't help you or hurt you if they've been funded, the collaboration with the partner has been funded previously. Another collaboration, can you comment on how you view collaboration across organizations? Again, collaboration is important. I mean, again, it's the way you can have a broader reach. It's sometimes the way you can pull together different aspects, maybe that your organization has or hasn't worked on. But again, it's also not required. This is again about sort of trust and the intervention. Collaboration just for this grant isn't always a good thing. And the reason I say this, I've been on the nonprofit side, I've been on the funder side, I've been on the government side. There's plenty of times where funders require collaboration. To us, it's most important is how the community is being served. And so if you're going to collaborate, you guys have to have strong relationships. You have to trust one another. You have to trust each intervention. You have to have shared values and vision. And if you do, that's great. But I would rather not see somebody just coming together in order to get funding if that collaboration is not going to last or not benefit either organization, or more importantly, not benefit the youth 0 to 26 or the parents and allies being served out of that. So collaboration is good if it's authentic and real collaboration. Are small organizations eligible? Yes, as long as you are a nonprofit in serving in the city and county of Denver. Again, you have to have a 501c3, or you can be a city agency as well. If you are not a 501c3, consider using, if you don't have your 501c3 status, you can use a fiscal agent. So that could be another nonprofit. There are organizations that serve as those fiscal sponsors. So again, your budget isn't necessarily what makes you eligible or not eligible. We have funded very small organizations to very large organizations. What I will say is, generally, we don't want to be more than 1/3 of your organizational budget. So when you're making a request, just keep that in mind, because there are IRS rules and regulations about us as a foundation being too large of a portion of your budget. So keep that. And if possible, we like to not be the only funder for a program or project. That doesn't mean we haven't been, especially as we're starting up new things. But then we're gonna, even if we are, we're gonna be looking and asking you about sustainability and how you're gonna grow that funding base and how you grow it beyond our funding. We don't want something to exist or not exist solely because of our funding in the long term. That does a disservice to you and community. Jennifer, did you want to add anything?
I think we will look at new projects that need some runway to get up and going, but we definitely do want to look at sustainability and how that's going to play out.
If organizations serve Denver and non-Denver youth, would you consider a grant to that organization? Yes, but again, we can only fund the Denver youth component of that. So you would need to be able to track and show us that, this is how many Denver youth you served, and this is how you use our dollars serving those Denver youth. So you, as an organization or an agency, would need to be able to track who is Denver youth and who is not Denver youth. Are faith-based organizations eligible? Yes, they are eligible. What I will say is you cannot use our dollars, though, for faith-based activities, meaning can't be used for proselytizing. I have coffee. I am smarter with it, so I'm going to take a sip. In our frequently asked questions, and I think even in our call, it might be more in our frequently asked questions, we describe sort of what are activities allowed from faith-based organizations. But if programs require membership in a certain religion or seek to advance a particular religious faith or belief, then we will not fund it. But if you are a faith-based organization running a program open to all, that doesn't require a certain belief or require religious activity in order to participate in that program, then yes, you are eligible. Is there a funding percentage or match we need from other resource streams? No. But again, we'll always look at sustainability. I mean, if you have a match, that's always great. We always love to see our dollars go further. Again, we prefer not to be the only funder for a program or project, but we know sometimes as you're starting things up, we might be. But then we'll really want to look towards ongoing sustainability, because again, when we're the only funder, that puts you all at risk if we can't continue to fund it in the future. And that's not something we want to do to community. Again, we're trying to build trust in services and programs and making mental health and substance misuse services more accessible. And so that's trust in the program, but it's trust in those services being there. So again, always good when there's other resources coming towards that project or program, but again, it's not a requirement. How might reductions in Denver budgets impact funding amounts in 2020? I will answer that question one of two ways. Because again, I think if you're talking about Denver city budgets or organizational budgets, we are not trying to supplant any funding. So meaning that if the city of county of Denver had funded certain activities, even knowing that some of the revenues are going down, we can't automatically pick up those expenses. We can't supplant funding that has already been that way. We know everybody's budget has been impacted by 2020. Everything has been impacted by 2020. But that also includes our funding. So as sales tax revenues go down, so does our estimated sales tax. So again, we'll have a better sense in March of what those 2020 funds will be. Again, we have a little more funds right now than we will have next year. And that we will have, well, again, don't know what the year after that will look like. So again, we are as dependent on the economy as all of you. So again, just be thinking about that. While we might have a little more money to give away, that up to 10 million, it's likely we won't have that next year. It'll probably be closer to the 5 to 6. And again, we're trying to somewhat not have such big ebbs or flows, but again, it's just something to think about. Again, we are a revenue source. We should never be the sole revenue source. So I'm not sure if that's what you wanted answer to in the Denver budget's impact. But if it isn't, ask the question again, and I'll try to answer it right. Can a large organization or university apply for multiple programs, or is the proposal one per organization? It is one per organization where you are the lead. So if you are a large organization, a university or institute, you as an organization can apply for one grant. It doesn't mean you can't partner on other grants. It doesn't mean you couldn't be a recipient of funding for some other work in another grant, but we're asking one application per organization in terms of that lead. So hopefully that sort of, but we don't want to discourage partnerships. So if you partner on other grants, it doesn't mean you couldn't also receive funding in those other grants. I would just say, what I would say avoid is, if you have two ideas, and you are the majority recipient of funding in each of those, even if somebody else applied, we're going to look at that. So just what I'll say is, it means you as an organization need to prioritize what's the important program or project that you really want to see funding that best fits with what we ask for. Appreciate community input. Is any of the data you collected publicly available? Yeah, yes and no. Yes is what I'll generally say. So our funding document, if you go to our website and go to our reports page, there is our Caring for Denver funding document. It looks like this, our strategic funding. Oops, sorry. That's the problem with background. So that's available on our website. All the words in there are really reflected from what we heard from community. And I'll say a lot of it was more that, what did we hear? What did we listen to? We can give you the numbers of how many people we reached out to. And then we asked people in that original 1,600, we said, pick the top issues that are most important to you. And that's where our 4 funding areas came from: alternatives to jail, youth, care provision, and community centered. And then the additional outreach is reflected in the call for proposal. So everything we heard is in the call for proposal. It is their words. It is what was important to them, to youth, to parents, and some of the providers that really work with youth. So our data is more that way. The stories we put on the website, we will be sending out an e-newsletter or e-blast today that will attach a piece of this recording, but also some of the quotes that we got from youth and parents will be in that e-newsletter as well. So again, it's more of that qualitative kind of, you'll see the words, everything we learned is here. But if you want to learn more, I'm always happy, myself and Gary, who's in charge of our community engagement, we're happy to sit down and try to answer your questions. Have you adjusted goals of this area considering the impact of COVID? Yes, is what I'll say. Again, all the things, what I'll say in the call for proposal, when we talk about connections and building resilience, that exists. Well, it's more important, life stresses and pressures because of COVID right now. But we recognize some of these interventions might be electronic, given some of this. Some of these might have to be delayed a little bit. We know that as organizations, you've been trying to figure out how to switch your programming to address to the needs of COVID. We're going to look at how you're addressing COVID, but this is also, we will get beyond COVID as well. And so it's looking at What do we need to do over this next year? But what do we need to do in years 2 and 3? How do we really address some of the needs of youth? What we heard from youth, it reflected what they're feeling, but the feelings aren't restricted to COVID. It's isolation existed before COVID. Harm to self and others existed before. Some of those numbers are higher than they are before. People are having to navigate many things they haven't had to navigate before. COVID has really highlighted what existed related to inequities, has highlighted the challenges in accessing care in many different things. And so we recognize it, but this is where I'll say, if you look at our funding document, the issues we identified pre-COVID and haven't changed. It's just they've grown. And again, that's why we have a larger amount right now, because we recognize that impact. And again, it's not always going to be there, but we know we have to do better for our youth, our parents, and our communities. Our charter school networks, 501c3 within DPS eligible? Yes. Easy. Would proposals that focus on policy changes at the state level be appropriate? Or are you most focused on direct services? So I might choose an option 3 in that. So we recognize in order to make some of those long-term changes that might involve changing things at a rule or regulatory or a city level. State level changes, we won't fund. I mean, again, we are focused on the city and county of Denver. If you are looking at some of the barriers that exist in the city and county of Denver, that is something related to youth and what we need to create to support youth. That's something that we will look at. And so it's not just about direct services. It's programming. It's what will support youth and parents and families and caregivers related to their mental health and substance misuse. But state level work, Denver metro level work, we will not fund. Again, you'll have to go to that city and county of Denver level. That is where our funding is restricted to. Will there be an RFP to offer TA coaching to center youth voices in our work? That's a great question. I don't know the answer to that. Again, we're always happy to talk to you about how we've engaged youth and brought youth to the center of how to do this. If part of what you need to ask us for is some time to work with youth to do this, you can do that. I don't know that there'll be another RFP. We are trying to learn how do we support nonprofits, not just in this grant making, but what is other capacity and technical assistance we can offer. And so we'll definitely think about that, think about how do we learn what we've done to center youth voices in your work. Again, given the competitiveness of this, if youth hasn't been already a center, you might not be as competitive. I will just say that. Again, but how do you make sure that youth continue to be, or even as you're building this, how you're going to test it? Feel free to write it. If you need capacity or TAs in order to do your work well, write that into the proposal as part of it. Again, just given the needs, we might not focus as much. Sometimes people want to do just planning grants. And I recognize the value and importance of that. Again, it's a competitive process is what I'll say best. Will there be TA for grantees to ensure they authentically partner with youth? Again, it's sort of a similar question to say, yeah. I mean, again, I'd say like if you want thought partnership and how you authentically partner with youth, there are a lot of organizations that are doing that. So I would say if maybe collaborating with some of them as part of your grant, maybe write them in as part of your grant. We want to partner with this youth serving organization that lifts youth up so that we can learn how to better do it in our practice. So again, there are so many great organizations that are centering youth at their work that have done it well, that I'm sure that, if you reached out to them, they might be willing to partner with you. We're always happy to learn what we know. And again, what I'd say is if it's what you need to do your work well, write that into your grant as part of it.
It's a great place to partner.
Yep. What is the best way to show sustainability in the application? Great question. And I recognize that's hard to do. So if I was to ask, let me just refer back to myself. When people ask me how you make this sustainable, our typical answer is nonprofits or agencies is we'll find money other places. And I recognize that. And I recognize the time we're in. But what I'd say is sustainability is about, what relationships will you build? Is there some opportunity to make this self-sustaining? So sometimes it might be that if it's around direct care, you're going to become a Medicaid biller, and some of the funding for this position or program will come about that way. Or we might have fees, or again, but for some populations that might not make sense, and that might not make sense for your program. Are there foundation relationships you're going to be building to get their sort of buy-in so that they want to be a part of this program? Is there things that we want to learn? So again, it's one of those, I recognize it's one of those challenging things. Again, it's that thing that we will work with you on. And it's not saying that we'll just fund you and then we're going to walk away. But at the same time, every 3 years, we need to go back to community and say, are we funding the right things? Is this where you want Caring for Denver funds to be spent? And if people change their mind and say youth, when we go out and engage people again, if something else has popped up and youth is not as much of a priority, or care provision is not as much of a priority, or community centered is not as much of a priority, then we might have to phase out of that area. And if we're your sole funder, that presents you with a significant challenge as well as the community. And again, we want to be more than just a funder. We'll be your thought partner. We will try to help you, introduce you to other funders who think that it could be, a good fit. We'll try to help think about what are other opportunities. So if all we do is fund you, then we're not living up to the full potential of what we should be doing as your partner in this work. So the sustainability doesn't lie solely on you. We will be your partner in that. But again, I think every sustainability for something looks different.
I ask that question to everyone when I'm doing due diligence. And so I think I also look for diversity of ideas, not just we'll find the money somewhere, but this is what we've thought about. This is what we're approaching. This is what we're looking at. I also think about track record of whether the program existed and how it's been doing, or other programs your organization might have and how those are doing. So that's also something just more concretely that I think about when I think about sustainability and looking at grant proposals.
Yeah.
That's helpful.
Thank you, Jennifer. We've had a couple questions about if your proposal wasn't funded in community centered, is it a good fit for youth? So what I will say is there were some proposals that were in community centered that really were a better fit for youth or a better fit for care provision, meaning, again, not knowing which proposal that is, it's a little hard to answer, but I'm always happy to connect with you and say, where might it be the best fit? But what I'd say is, if your proposal is working with youth 0 to 26 or parents or allies, and the programming really resonates with the 3 areas and those additional criteria, then yes, go ahead and apply for this one. But if your proposal doesn't really align with this, if this is really about again, happy to talk to you a little bit. In all honesty, we're learning a little more about each funding area as we do the funding area to say, oh, this fits better here, or this fits better here. We are learning with you. And so again, I appreciate your patience as we all go through this, but I'm also happy to talk to you a little bit more about where might be the best fit. So I'm also recognizing time. So I just want to be respectful, but I also know we started about 5 minutes late. So we'll keep on going either as long as there are questions and or to 11:05. And again, this recording will be available. Are you open to having individual conversations about our organization specifics? Yes. Again, because this is an open call for proposal, I can't say, yes, that's a great fit, or no, that's not a great fit. I can point to parts in the call for proposal. I can share what I've said publicly, but I'm happy to to at least get you thinking about what are the kinds of questions we might be asking as you're thinking about that. The program officers can't do that because they are the ones reviewing the grants. So it would be myself who would be talking to you a little bit about sort of if it's really related to the youth call for proposal. If you have questions about the process of applying for a grant or the budget or any of those pieces, then Leah, our grants manager, would be the right person to talk to for that. And she's Leah at caring4denver.org, and I'm Lorez, Lorez, at caringfordenver.org. So you can reach out to one of us about that. Again, it's an open call for proposals, so we won't be able to give you really specifics, but can at least let you know sort of questions we might have. Why was a foundation created for this funding rather being focused within the city and county? It was, again, there's other examples like this, the Denver Prosperity Project, as well as Denver Preschool Program, but it allowed us to be nimble and sometimes more responsive to community in a quicker time frame. So we're able to get money into community within 4 months of the application. We were able to get some of our COVID funding out within a month of being within the shelter in place. We can be nimble. We can be really responsive to community. If you look at the grants that we funded, they're not always things that maybe get funded by the city because of needs the city has around liability or needs that the city has when they're contracting with somebody. So again, it also allows us to be innovative and take risk. And so again, as some of the folks that were really envisioning what Caring for Denver could be, we were created by and funded by community. And so we want to be reflective of that in what we do. And so hopefully you'll see that in the grants we've made. There are things like STAR. We were able to stand that up as a pilot, get money, in fact, to the city, but in partnership with others to create an alternative response. That might have taken a lot longer to do if it was solely located in the city. So again, we have a nimbleness. We can pilot and try things and learn from that. And then ideally it has enough support. So, as we talk about sustainability, we funded STAR as a pilot. It's shown really beneficial results. The city and city council have now allocated $1 million to $1.5 million. They'll still come to it as asked, but our initial investment of around $210,000 has leveraged and created the possibility for this program to be bigger and better. So that our ability to be nimble, to focus on innovation, and be really responsive to community is, I think, the intention of why we're a nonprofit. If a program is focused on supporting youth and extending resiliency, building support to adults with youth at home, will these services be provided to adults be eligible? So I think yes. Again, it's always hard to answer in perfect specificity from the question. So if you notice, the third part is really around adults and caregivers and those allies, because we know youth don't exist in a place and space on their own. And they need to be supported in home environments or in other environments in order to thrive. This isn't so much about just supports for adults. So you would just need to talk about that connection and why it's important for adults to have, and that relation to that youth 0 to 26, how it will help us achieve the desired impact. So those impacts are the same, whether this is supporting allies or parents and caregivers. And we, again, heard from youth how important it was. The parents and caregivers and adults and allies really hear them, listen to them. Don't just say, let me get you into front of this therapist. So this is much preparing the parents and allies as a way to better engage youth, really hear youth, and really support youth on their own path to recovery, not in always a parent or adult's vision of how we get there. So again, that's why youth voice is so important in this, and parents' voice is so important in this, caregivers, pregnant, whoever is that population or age group you're working with, how did you include the voice of community in the design and implementation, and sort of even saying how it's going to work. Because again, even out of best intent, we create a lot of programs that we think will work for others. But what this is really about is how do we create it with youth and having them, and again, when I say youth is 0 to 26, so again, depending on for the community, how do we make sure that it's being created with them, in partnership with them, led by them, so that we know that it'll have the intended impact. Can you support organization as part of a collaboration or as an individual nonprofit as long as the proposals are different? Can you support organization as part of a collaboration? Yes. So I think this is asking, if you apply for a grant and you're collaborating with somebody on a grant, would both of those grants be considered? And the answer is yes. But again, each grant will be viewed and sort of is competitive with all the other grants we receive. So, but it doesn't mean you can't be a collaborative funded partner on one grant and still be considered for an individual grant as well. Are organizations who receive money through Medicaid billing eligible? Are there other considerations we should be aware of? So as a nonprofit, if you are looking to get a position and part of it will be funded by Medicaid, we'll want to understand, how you'll be using that Medicaid funding. We are not going to, when we go to supplanting, we can't cover a Medicaid expense that then you're also billing Medicaid for. I will acknowledge, I know Medicaid doesn't pay for everything as well as you would like. Again, we are not trying to make up for shortcomings in the Medicaid program or others, but we will. So we'll work with you, and we know, especially when you start a new position, it takes a while to get that client mix to become self-sustaining. So again, that could be one of the sustainability issues. We might fund somebody for a period of time until you can get that Medicaid sustainability, and then they become more sustaining. We know there's some things that Medicaid doesn't cover that we can look at as well. So again, just make sure you ask us for, the budget is appropriate. Look at the call for proposal, look at the frequently asked questions. Hopefully that'll give you a lot of the consideration. So again, what I'll say on the call for proposal, focus particularly on the overview, our impact, and our award considerations. And we also list things that we'll fund and we won't fund in that call for proposal. It's on our resource page. So is our frequently asked question. We try to use these sessions and individual conversations to add to the frequently asked questions. But it's, again, make sure youth is important, but is equally as important. This is about mental health and substance misuse. So it shouldn't be an add-on. It is a key component of what we're looking for and what you're doing as it relates to that 0 to 26. It is in the city and county of Denver that we are funding only. So again, if you do bigger, that's okay, but we are only going to fund work in the city and county of Denver. So I think those are the biggest considerations, and questions have stopped. So appreciate your patience sticking with us for this hour. We look forward to hearing from you. Really just appreciate it all. So thank you all for joining us today. And again, appreciate your thoughtfulness, your time, your energy to support Denver youth. None of this work or our community-centered work or alternatives to jail would be possible without the important work that you all are doing. So thank you, and have a lovely day.
Thank you.